What's up, everybody, and welcome to the Scruffy Looking Nerdhers podcast. I've got a very special episode for you this week. Finally, this is the second History of episode, and this one is none other than the quote-unquote grayest Jedi ever, Qui Gon Jinn from Star Wars. So, I'm sitting here at an Outer Rim cantina, just chilling, having some drinks with a couple of aliens. And I'm going to tell them the history of Mr. Qui Gon Jinn of the Jedi Order. But before I dive into the history of Qui Gon Jinn, first, let me cite all of my sources. So, obviously, number one is Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, the Clone Wars TV show, Star Wars Rebels. I went back and I read the Age of Republic comics of Qui Gon Jinn. I listened to the audio drama of Dooku, Jedi Lost, which is fantastic. It's an audiobook written by Cavan Scott, and it was narrated by quite a few different narrators. Amazing. And I think it's only like a little over 380 minutes or something like that long. So, I mean, easily can breeze right through that. And the Master and Apprentice short story and the Master and Apprentice book, both written by Claudia Gray. And Star Wars Encyclopedia that I have. It's a physical copy. So, but first, now that I've told you where I've gotten my sources from, so a little behind the scenes of the character, like the conception of the character, similar to what I did with Iron Man. So George Lucas conceived the character of Qui Gon Jinn during pre-production of the film, and in the early concept art, it was mainly just Obi-Wan Kenobi that was shown on the Trade Federation flagship at the beginning, and while meeting Jar Jar Binks on Naboo. And even when Qui-Gon was conceived, Lucas played around with the idea of making him the younger Jedi of the two. And he originally envisioned an American actor for the role of Qui-Gon, but ultimately he ended up casting Liam Neeson because he considered Neeson to have great skills and presence, describing him as a master actor who other actors will look up to, who has got the qualities of strength of the character demands. And he's not wrong. Liam Neeson's a badass actor. And initially, Lucas had planned for Qui-Gon to have long white hair, but that idea was scrapped, and Qui-Gon is depicted as having long brown hair in the film. During the early development of Star Wars Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith, Lucas had wrote a scene featuring a Force Ghost version of Qui-Gon speaking with Yoda about Anakin. Liam Neeson was set to reprise his role for the movie because he hinted his possible appearance in the film. However, that scene was deleted from the film, and Neeson was never in studio to record. Although the scene was retained in the film's novelization, which is also a fantastic film novelization. I'm just going to go out and say, all of the adaptations from the Star Wars films into novels are fantastic because they give you the internal thoughts of the characters. They give you feelings and emotions that aren't well portrayed or even mentioned or anything in the movies, and not even just the prequels, but this goes for the original trilogy as well. Great stuff. And then there's scenes completely that aren't in the movie that you get in the novels. And so if you're ever wanting to dive deep in even just the lore of just the movies, I highly recommend reading any of the official novelizations of the episodes 1 through 6. I haven't read the sequel ones yet, but I imagine they're probably just as good. So the character's name of Qui-Gon is derived from the Chinese word, and I'm going to butcher this, Qui-Gong, a system of coordinated body movement, breathing, and meditation used for health, spirituality, and martial arts training that allows access to higher realms of awareness and balance of life energy similar to Tai Chi. And so he paired that word with the word jinn, which is an Arabic origin, meaning genie or tutelary spirit. The name translates almost literally as guardian spirit of the living force. And Jinn also could refer to the Chinese word for power, which is also Jin. And the martial arts concept of Fa Jin, which is the explosive release of internal strength or power. So that was kind of like the backstory, origin, history of the character of Qui Gon Jinn, and like where George Lucas got the inspiration from. And it seems like a pretty cut and dry kind of thing with Qui Gon. I don't think that George Lucas really went super deep into creating a character, but I will kind of get into how the other creators and writers have really fleshed out Qui-Gon as just a really like interesting character. And he's not my favorite characters from he's one of my favorite characters from Star Wars, but he's not my ultimate favorite, but he's at least top 5. And just because of how he wasn't just like the poster boy for the Jedi Order. I liked that he always pushed back and challenged them, because I thought that was great. So Qui-Gon Jinn was a Force-sensitive human who was born on the core world of Coruscant, the capital of the Galactic Republic, around 79 years before the Battle of Yavin. So the Battle of Yavin is, of course, the battle that takes place on in Episode 4, A New Hope, whenever they destroy the first Death Star. That's the Battle of Yavin. So Qui-Gon eventually learned the ways of the Force as the Padawan of Jedi Master Dooku, before eventually becoming the rank of Jedi Knight. Like, some of the first things that, with the history between Qui-Gon and Dooku, which Dooku kind of hinted at in Attack of the Clones to Obi-Wan Kenobi. But so in some of the earlier missions, Qui-Gon and Dooku became a part of a strike team that were assembled to track and find a bounty hunter named Shinda Mole. And they eventually tracked her to her hideout on the planet Numidian Prime, and while searching for her hideout, Qui-Gon was captured by Mole. Before she could kill him, Dooku ended up using Force Lightning in an effort to save him, and even though Qui-Gon was quite grateful for having his life saved, it threw up some red flags for him about Dooku and his future. Qui-Gon later confided what Dooku did to save him to Rael Averross, which was another Jedi in the Jedi Order, and Averross expressed that he was not all too concerned regarding Count Dooku or Master Dooku's conduct. And so eventually Qui-Gon went on to become a Jedi Master in his own right, and he developed a very independent attitude, I guess you could say, towards the Jedi Order, which is what I was kind of talking about earlier. That's why I like him as much as I do. And he was seen as, quote-unquote, a maverick in the Order. He would easily disobey the Jedi Code if he felt it was the right decision, and he kind of saw it as more of like guidelines than actual rules. And so Qui-Gon eventually took on a Padawan of his own, and we all know as Obi-Wan Kenobi, who believed that Qui-Gon could have been a member of the Jedi Council if he had only followed the code. Though, as Kenobi knew, Jinn had rejected an offer to join. On one occasion, Qui-Gon and Kenobi were sent on an extended mission to the planet Mandalore, where a civil war had been raging between various Mandalorian factions, and Qui-Gon and his Padawan were assigned to protect Duchess Satine of the pacifist New Mandalorians faction, who had become a target for insurgents. And for those of you who are familiar with the Duchess Satine, she was a character from the Clone Wars, and also had some pretty deep history with Obi-Wan. So, Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan spent a year on Mandalore, constantly on the run from bounty hunters targeting Satine. During the mission, Kenobi developed romantic feelings for the Jedi's charge, Eventually, the Civil War came to an end, and Satine becoming the ruler of Mandalore. Jin had at least some contact with his old master after taking on Kenobi, and spoke highly of his Padawan to Dooku. At one point, Jin and Kenobi traveled to the planet Lamu to visit a fortress. And so, another thing that I felt was really interesting with Qui-Gon was, so anytime we've seen like Obi-Wan or Yoda as a Force ghost, it can all be tracked back to Qui-Gon, because at some point during his life, he began discovering the secrets to manifesting his self or his spirit or his consciousness even after death. So he traveled to a planet strong with the Force, a world that legends had said was the birthplace of life and the origin of midichlorians. And so there, he learned from 5 Force priestesses who had retained their own consciousness after death. He learned that when a living thing died, its life passed through the living Force and into the cosmic Force to become one with the Force. And as the living Force and the cosmic Force existed in tandem, it became possible for one to retain their consciousness and physically manifest themselves after death. So Qui-Gon was considered worthy of the knowledge of that eternal life and secretly began his training to fully unlock it. He also learned from a shaman of the wills that achieving eternal consciousness required absolute selflessness. Without Qui-Gon going through all of this stuff and learning all of this, he taught Yoda, and Yoda taught Obi-Wan. So maybe, just maybe, Obi-Wan or Yoda might have taught, Luke at some point. So maybe we'll see Force Ghost Luke in the future. I don't know. So, as I said, in the Age of the Republic comics, so at one point, Qui-Gon was guided to a world by the Force itself after the rescue of Thair, and felt the presence of the dark side. And so when Qui-Gon entered a monument that was just like radiating dark side energy, he had a Force vision, but was able to break free from it once the light side found its way back to him. And when he left the world, having concluded that violence could lead the Jedi to become what they claimed to fight against. So, all these things are really helping mold Qui-Gon into this this character who more of what we saw of Luke in The Last Jedi, where the Jedi were such fanatics and so fanatical about the light side of the Force that they didn't stop to think that their actions could also lead to them basically being the same thing that they're fighting against. Just a certain point of view. And so throughout the comic as well, there's at some point during about 32 years before the Battle of Yavin, Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan were in vicinity of a planet that served as a base to the Fleshmongers pirate organization, and the two received a message from the surface of the planet from Yoda, who was asking for assistance. And so upon landing on the planet, Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan discovered that Yoda had taken out the entire pirate gang in order to rescue a single young Force-sensitive child. And the pirates had planned to sell him due to his abilities in the Force. So Yoda asked Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan if they would escort the infant back to the Jedi Temple, with Yoda assuming that the child was in safe hands with Qui-Gon. Qui-Gon expressed that he was happy to help out as they had been so close. And while the two conversed, Obi-Wan took particular interest in the fact that Yoda had taken out an entire room of pirates and was totally in awe. Qui-Gon then proceeded to ask Yoda if everything was all right, to which the Master replied that he could sense a calling disturbance in the Force that he felt he must follow. Qui-Gon noted that he could not feel the presence, but offered to join him on his quest if he wanted him to. And as Yoda climbed onto a ship, he informed Qui-Gon that he felt it was a calling just for him alone, and so then he embarked on a mission to the planet in the Vagadar system. And another issue, there was Mace Windu, who was sent to a planet of Usulon to search for several Padawans who had been kidnapped by the warlord Guataco. And eventually Windu was able to defeat all of Guataco's army, and Guataco was killed by a young Jedi. Shortly after, Qui-Gon, Plo Koon, and Dippa Billaba arrived to help. So, one thing with Qui-Gon too is he is a very compassionate and empathetic person, and he's always willing to help. That's one thing I've noticed from all this reading that I've done leading up to this episode. He's very adamant about helping and cares for his brothers and sisters in the Order very deeply. But he also understands that they shouldn't just be strictly following like the Jedi Code. And that's one thing that I liked about him. And I kind of want to segue a little bit. So I've mentioned it before, but I really, really dislike the term Gray Jedi, because a Jedi is someone who follows the Jedi Code. And, you know, in like the Knights of the Republic games and stuff, they've had like Dark Jedi and stuff like that, but that's a topic for another discussion, or that's a discussion for another day. Everyone always tries to akin Qui-Gon to a Gray Jedi, and essentially a Gray Jedi, if you're unaware, is someone who just walks the line of just being just like a Force user. And if anything, I would just call those kinds of people just Force users, because I don't feel like there is, like, you can't be kind of a Jedi. You're a Jedi or you aren't. You're a Sith or you aren't. So, anyway, but I really enjoy how he challenges the Jedi Council and everyone around him. One thing I liked from the Master and Apprentice book was, at one point, I believe it was Obi-Wan that was talking about how he was extremely rebellious, it was Qui-Gon letting Obi-Wan know why he got partnered up with him as a Master and Apprentice type thing. And the reason why he was the Padawan for Qui-Gon was because Obi-Wan was an extremely rebellious individual and would rebel against what he was being taught. So if Qui-Gon had like this mindset of rebelling and kind of like using the Jedi Code as a guideline rather than strict rules, then Obi-Wan would rebel against that and become a straight shooting, straight arrow type Jedi. And so I thought that was kind of interesting, and it was really cool reading Master and Apprentice and listening to the Dooku Jedi Lost, because you could see these parallels between how Dooku was with Qui-Gon and explaining to Qui-Gon how you're going to be alone. You're never going to have anyone. You're always going to be alone if you're a Jedi. You're always going to be alone. And not really having like a great Master Padawan relationship. Whereas with Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan, they had a really great relationship between the two. Even though Obi-Wan would be at odds with Qui-Gon at times, he still respected him and was wanting to try to earn his respect at all times. And then seeing how Obi-Wan and Anakin were. So Obi-Wan was trying to continue on what he had been taught and how he had been taught with Qui-Gon, but it just wasn't quite there. And so instead of being more of like a fatherly figure to Anakin, he was more of like an older brother. And it wasn't until that scene before Obi-Wan goes to leave to go to attack, go and attack like General Grievous towards the end of Episode 3. It wasn't until about that moment that you really kind of see their relationship connect, like with Obi-Wan and Anakin. And I'm going to touch on something after I complete the life and story of Qui Gon Jinn, and I'll touch on something a little bit later that kind of falls in line with that. So, 10 years prior to the Clone Wars, the Trade Federation blockaded Naboo, as we saw in Episode 1, and planned to invade it in retaliation for the Galactic Republic's taxation of trade routes in outlying star systems. Unknown to the Republic, the Federation was controlled by the Sith Lord Darth Sidious, who was secretly Senator Palpatine. And he engineered this conflict so he could be elected Supreme Chancellor. The then Supreme Chancellor, Valorum, dispatched Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan to Naboo, tasking them with resolving the situation through a diplomatic discourse. Upon arriving at the Federation command ship, Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan were escorted into a conference room where they were told that the Viceroy would greet them. While they were waiting, Darth Sidious had contacted the Viceroys and had ordered them to execute the Jedi. While Qui-Gon could sense the fear in the Neimoidians, this alerted him to know that this was not a normal trade dispute. Those suspicions were confirmed when the Federation flooded the conference room with a poisonous gas in an attempt to kill Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan. But the two were able to hold their breath long enough for the Federation to open the doors and inadvertently give the Jedi a chance to escape. So they fought the droids that were waiting outside the door, they moved their way through the ventilation shafts, and they made their way to the hangar, and they stowed away on ships down to Naboo, and that's where they met Jar Jar. So, like I said before, Qui-Gon is a very empathetic individual, and more so with different races, which you kind of get more of that throughout, like all like the different readings with Qui-Gon and like the books and the audiobook and with the comic books. So you really start to see his empathy towards these different alien races, and you definitely see it in Episode 1, and with none other than the wonderful Jar Jar Binks. And he saved Jar Jar from being ran over by a troop carrier of the Federation, and so Jar Jar swore a life debt to Qui-Gon for saving him, and as Qui-Gon did try to get rid of him, but he finally agreed to let him tag along because Jar Jar was going to take him to the underwater city of his people. You know the story. They got the Bongo transport, and they made their way through the planet core. There's always a bigger fish. And then they went and they rescued the queen and her guards and handmaidens, made their way to the hangar. They escaped in the queen's ship off of Naboo, and they then had to make an emergency landing on Tatooine. So, while landed on Tatooine, the crew determined that they were in need of a new hyperdrive generator in order to make their final destination of Coruscant. So Qui-Gon ventured out with Amidala, who was masquerading as a handmaiden, and Jar Jar Binks. So they arrived at Watto's shop, they made the deal, they met Anakin, who was a slave, and you know, we kind of see it's interesting to see like the juxtaposition of Qui-Gon in Episode 1, where, you know, he's like, you know, we're not here to free slaves, you know, that's not why he was there. But in, I want to say it was Master and Apprentice, there's this entire mission where Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan are freeing slaves. So, and I don't know if it was Qui-Gon, you know, obviously the movie was out before that book was made, and I get that, but in keeping in the lore of everything, maybe Qui-Gon at that point in Episode 1 knew that if he were to start just freeing slaves on Tatooine, that that would probably not bode too well with the Jedi Council. So Anakin wins the pod race, and Qui-Gon gambles on it while using the Force, and yada yada yada. So Anakin has to leave his mom. He's heartbroken. So Qui-Gon goes to board the Queen's ship again with Anakin in tow. And that's whenever we meet the evil Sith Lord Darth Maul. The two fought. Qui-Gon and Darth Maul fought across the desert while Anakin rushed his way back to the ship to let them know that he needed help. And they were able to get to him in a timely manner before he got sliced in half, and they were able to leave, leaving Darth Maul behind. And hyperdrive was repaired. They made their way to Coruscant, and that's when Qui-Gon went before the Jedi Council and informed the Jedi Masters that he believed Darth Maul was a Sith Lord. The Council was very iffy about the claim, as the Jedi Order had believed that they had destroyed the Sith a millennium earlier. But they committed themselves to learning Darth Maul's identity. Qui-Gon also revealed that he had discovered Anakin on Tatooine and believed him to be the Chosen One, which was the prophecy of the Chosen One to bring balance to the Force. And he asked that the boy be trained as a Jedi. At Qui-Gon's request, the Council agreed to test Skywalker to determine if he was eligible for training, and Obi-Wan was very skeptical that Anakin would even pass the test given his age, as Jedi typically begin their training at infancy or very, very young, and was worried that Qui-Gon would defy whatever the decision the Council made. And despite his Padawan's concerns, Qui-Gon was determined to see Skywalker become a Jedi Knight. So the Council tested him and agreed that Qui-Gon that he was exceptionally powerful with the Force, but declined to accept him for training. They believed that despite his power, he was too old to begin training and dangerously full of fear and anger because of being taken away from his mom. Regardless of that, Obi-Wan was correct. Qui-Gon insisted that Skywalker be trained, saying that he would take the boy as his own Padawan learner, and informing them that Kenobi was more than capable of taking the Jedi trials and become a Jedi Knight himself, since the Jedi Code would not allow Qui-Gon to take on two Padawans. But the Council tabled the discussion for another time and demanded that Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan return to Naboo, where Amidala was preparing to return to in order to deal with the invasion of the Federation without the Senate's help. Qui-Gon took Anakin with him and began giving him some initial lessons about the Force. So they go back to Naboo. There's this whole infiltration thing going on. It's actually some of the best scenes in the movie, and they are taking back over the Theed capital and trying to release all the forces so they can fight against the battle droids. And then there's the Gungan army fighting the majority of the forces away from the city in order to get Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan and the Queen's guards and all them inside to infiltrate. And so once they were inside the hangar, they were confronted by Darth Maul yet again, and the two Jedi prepared to fight as the Naboo fought their way to the throne room to capture the Viceroy Gunray. So Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan fought Darth Maul in the hangar, and honestly, that scene and that music, the Duel of the Fates, is honestly, out of all the prequels, out of the 3 prequel movies, that scene was some of the best choreography, I guess, with the lightsaber fights and stuff like that. Some of the best, actually the best scene in the original trilogy, or in the prequel trilogy. I'm so sorry. And so they fight their way through the palace, and then they make their way out of the hangar into the palace generator complex, and you see all the cool light beams and all that stuff going all over the place. Really cool visuals. And Maul separated Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan by knocking Obi-Wan down several levels and eventually trapping him behind shielding, leaving Qui-Gon to fight Darth Maul in single combat without his apprentice's help. And as they made their way through the area, the two were evenly matched. Eventually, however, Maul countered Qui-Gon with a physical strike from his lightsaber hilt and stunning him, and then taking that opportunity to finally stabbing the Jedi Master through the torso as Obi-Wan watched in horror from behind the shielding. And we know what happens next. Obi-Wan goes freaking apeshit and lunges at him with a fury of blows with his lightsaber, and gets knocked down into the reactor shaft, and then he force pulls the lightsaber, does a flip and all that. Even though Darth Maul had the high ground, he was still able to do that. I don't know how, but he did. And he sliced Darth Maul in half and sent him down the shaft. And so then Obi-Wan went over, cradled Qui-Gon in his arms, and Qui-Gon made his apprentice promise him that he would train Anakin as a Jedi, and once again informed him that Anakin was the chosen one and would bring balance to the Force as his dying words. So, the day was saved. The Naboo successfully captured the Viceroy and ended the occupation of Naboo. Obi-Wan was granted the rank of Jedi Knight and insisted on taking Skywalker as his apprentice, and even though Yoda disagreed, the Council approved Obi-Wan's request, fulfilling Qui-Gon's dying wish, and Skywalker would be trained as a Jedi. Later, Qui-Gon was given a funeral on Naboo where his body was burned on a funeral pyre, and the funeral was attended by a vast number of people, including Queen Amidala, the Jedi Council, and Palpatine. It was at this funeral that Obi-Wan informed Anakin that he would be trained, and that Obi-Wan would be his master. Together, the two mourned the death of Qui-Gon as Kenobi vowed to Anakin that he would become a Jedi. So, as I said earlier, Qui-Gon spent a majority of his, I wouldn't say majority of his time, but he spent a great amount of time training to have the ability to return as a Force spirit or a Force ghost. And like I said, he had not fully learned it, and so he could not physically manifest himself, and he could only speak as a disembodied voice. One of the first known times that Qui-Gon communicated was about 10 years after the events on Naboo. Anakin had returned to Tatooine to find his mother. We see this in Attack of the Clones. And because Anakin kept having recurring nightmares and discovered that she had been kidnapped by Tusken Raiders. He found her in a Tusken camp, but she died only moments after finding her. In his anger, Anakin just massacred all the Tusken Raiders in that camp, and Qui-Gon, sensing the great pain and distress, called out to Anakin through the Force, which Yoda could hear, but could not comprehend through his own meditations. However, Qui-Gon's pleas fell on deaf ears as Anakin didn't heed his words during his uncontrolled rage. So despite his incomplete training, Qui-Gon was able to physically manifest on at least one occasion. Obi-Wan, Anakin, and Ahsoka had been lured to the planet Mortis by three beings known as the Father, Son, and the Daughter. This takes place in the Clone Wars animation. And like Qui-Gon, these three beings believed that Anakin was the chosen one. Qui-Gon first appeared to Kenobi to warn him that the beings sought Anakin and his potential as the chosen one, to use it for their own usage. And when Obi-Wan questioned how Qui-Gon could appear, he told him that the planet acted as an amplifier and that it was a conduit through which the Force flowed through. The two spoke about Anakin and his power, with Obi-Wan having the opportunity to tell Qui-Gon that the late Jedi Master's predictions about Anakin were true. He was stronger than any other Jedi, yet he could not find the balance that Qui-Gon warned that if Anakin was the chosen one, then he would discover it on Mortis, and if not, then the planet would prove to be very dangerous for someone so powerful. Qui-Gon later appeared to Anakin himself, telling him that he still believed the boy would bring balance to the Force after facing his demons. After the three Jedi escaped Mortis, where the Father professed his belief that Anakin was the chosen one, Obi-Wan came to believe and told the Jedi Council that the appearance of Qui-Gon was simply an illusion, one manifested from their memories by the beings on Mortis. Anakin, however, was not as confident, despite Jedi teachings saying that it was impossible for a being to retain their identity after death. This report about Mortis did not change these Jedi beliefs or teachings. The Clone Wars also saw that the return of Qui-Gon's murderer, Darth Maul, believed to have been killed by Kenobi on Naboo. Maul had in fact survived the fall, massive fall, replacing his lower body with cybernetic legs. Darth Maul sought revenge on Kenobi for maiming him, and the two fought on several occasions. Nevertheless, Maul would go on to survive the Clone Wars. It wasn't until the later days of the Clone Wars that Yoda had learned that Qui Gon had actually learned to be able to retain his consciousness after death through the Force. Knowing Yoda was destined to be a major part in bringing balance to the Force, and it was Yoda's destiny to complete the training that Qui Gon could not do himself. The late Jedi Master spoke to Yoda through the Force and guided him to Dagobah, the first leg on Yoda's trials to determine whether he was ready to learn the secrets. Qui-Gon told Yoda about his training and how the living force fed into the cosmic force and allowing him to return after death. Yoda was only interested at first about the Clone Wars at hand, asking if he could tell him the true identity of Darth Sidious, but Qui-Gon could only guide Yoda through his trials. Yoda was guided by the living force in the form of a glowing swarm of fireflies. Later, they guided Yoda to the planet of the Force Priestesses, where Yoda could continue his trials. Once Yoda had completed his trial and was deemed worthy of learning the secret of eternal consciousness, as Yoda would one day train the person who would help Skywalker bring balance to the Force. The Force Priestesses instructed that Qui-Gon would guide Yoda's training. After the end of the Clone Wars and the fall of the Jedi Order, Yoda chose to go into exile on Dagobah, but not before telling Obi-Wan that Qui-Gon had returned from the netherworld of the Force and could guide his former Padawan in learning the secret. But unfortunately, at the end of the Clone Wars, we saw the fall of Anakin Skywalker, who was seduced to the dark side of the Force by Darth Sidious and had become a Sith Lord himself, named Darth Vader. The fall confirmed the fears of the Council about Anakin's training, but he was still the chosen one. During Obi-Wan's self-imposed exile on Tatooine, he frequently dwelled upon his failure to train Skywalker. And one such time, during meditation, he felt himself phase out of reality for a little while, and during this time, he felt Qui-Gon commune through the Force with him. In the years after the Clone Wars, Obi-Wan and Yoda both completed their training to retain their consciousness after death. There was a couple of one-shot issues. I think there was at least one that I remember. I remember reading it, but there was a one-shot issue of the Star Wars comic, like the main comic run that Marvel was doing. And so there was a story, it was basically Luke reading the journals of Obi-Wan about his time on Tatooine. And so during Obi-Wan's time on Tatooine, he continued to speak with Qui-Gon, telling him about the hardships of living in exile and Skywalker's possible destiny of the Chosen One. And so during an encounter with the Wookiee bounty hunter Black Krrsantan, Obi-Wan called upon his master to give him strength to defeat the foe. And Kenobi finally, at one point in a duel against Darth Maul, finally killed him 2 years before the Battle of Yavin, using Qui-Gon's Ataru stance to defend himself against Maul. The 1 year before the Battle of Yavin, Qui-Gon's voice was heard by the Padawan Ezra Bridger during his mission to a place that existed between time and space. 1 year later, Obi-Wan sacrificed himself to save Luke Skywalker, Anakin's son, and was struck down by Darth Vader. Though worried for not completing Luke's training, Obi-Wan heard Qui-Gon's voice telling him to lay down his life so that Luke can escape. So that's a neat little tidbit because we don't really get that in the original trilogy. So having that little bit of information gleaned as to why Obi-Wan made that decision to sacrifice himself. And it's interesting too because Obi-Wan's journey after death, of how at first he just appeared as a disembodied voice and then eventually was able to manifest himself as like an actual, I wouldn't say physical, but in a more physical form later on. After the Battle of Yavin, when Vader was shot down over the planet Vrogus Voss, during a confrontation with Rebel Alliance forces on the planet, Vader found an ancient Jedi temple. There, Vader heard the disembodied voices of people from his past, including Qui-Gon. And a few years later, Obi-Wan appeared as a physical spirit to tell Luke to train with Yoda on Dagobah, and he continued to manifest himself to help guide Luke through his training. I've kind of touched on it a little bit throughout this episode, but I will dig a little deeper into the personality of Qui-Gon himself. So, though he had eventually became the rank of Jedi Master, he did not always agree with the structure and the rules of the Jedi Order, as displayed throughout all the different stories I've explained to you. And he was well known to disobey the Jedi Code if he felt like he needed to, and was willing to argue with the Jedi Council when they declined to train Skywalker. So while other Jedi focused on meditation to try to understand the future, Qui-Gon lived in the moment. He believed that a person's focus on the future should not compromise their concentration on the present, and he believed in trusting in one's instincts. Even after his death and return as a spirit, Qui-Gon was confronted with Jedi only of the future, as I talked about with Yoda. Like, Yoda wanted to know who Darth Sidious was. And even though Qui-Gon hinted that he knew who he was, he explained, I can only guide you towards greater knowledge and not provide you with the answers. And as I mentioned earlier, Qui-Gon is a very empathetic person, and he has a tendency to take unfortunate life forms under his protection. It was this tendency, as well as his defiant attitude towards the Council, that often frustrated and baffled Obi-Wan Kenobi. And this empathy towards all life forms that he showed, including extremely pitiful and annoying and just the ones, was honestly Qui-Gon's greatest strength. Ah, sweet. Thank you. The drinks are here at the table, so drink up, everyone. Oh, yeah, that's good. Ooh. So, you might be asking, well, how powerful was Qui-Gon, right? So let me answer that for you. So Qui-Gon was extremely sensitive to the Force, and he utilized telekinesis and mind tricks on more than one occasion, using them to help further his goals during the Trade Federation's occupation of Naboo, and while attempting to free Anakin from slavery. And Qui-Gon was skilled with a lightsaber and was able to use his blade to easily defeat battle droids on Naboo and hold his own in his first duel with Darth Maul. Like I said, he was like the first to learn the ability to manifest his consciousness after death. And like I said, it was a skill no other Jedi was able to learn, and they had no idea because they were always trained that you couldn't do that. And so he was the first to do that. And because of that, he taught Yoda, who taught Obi-Wan, and them being able to have that was a way for Luke to be able to fulfill the prophecy of the Chosen One and finally guide Luke to his destiny. Okay, so notable reading, like I said, the Age of Republic Qui-Gon comics are fantastic. I highly recommend them. Read Master and Apprentice. There's one in the From a Certain Point of View. It's like a compilation of different short stories, and it's titled Master and Apprentice. I highly recommend reading that entire book. It's really good. And then also there is an actual book called Master and Apprentice, and it is written by Claudia Gray. I highly recommend it. The short story is really neat. It's during the time when of episode 4, whenever Luke is going back to Lars' homestead to try to hope that he can save his Uncle Owen and Aunt Beru. And Obi-Wan and 3PO and R2 are picking up the bodies of the murdered Jawas. And so during that time, Qui-Gon had appeared to Obi-Wan, and since that, been feared for the safety of Luke. And Qui-Gon tells Obi-Wan to rescue him, or he may rescue himself, implying similarities between Luke's story and Anakin's, like his upbringing and the events that led to what happened. And Qui-Gon even mentioned that the sister may find the brother instead. And Obi-Wan feared that Luke would end up being killed. And Qui-Gon once again reassured him that Luke has yet to embark on a great journey and that it doesn't end on Tatooine. There's a nice, touching moment between them because Obi-Wan blames himself for having failed, Anakin and Satine and Padme and even Qui-Gon. But then Qui-Gon reassures him that the responsibility for failure lies with himself and only himself. And it's at this point, too, that Obi-Wan confides with Qui-Gon that he did not tell Luke the whole truth about Anakin, and that he was a little misleading on how he worded it to him. And Qui-Gon reassured him that he had only just recently gotten to know Luke, and to tell him the whole truth would have planted seeds of doubt, confusion, and anger, leading him down the very same path that his father went on. And so Qui-Gon counseled him about the best time to tell him, and wanted him to wait until he was more stable and stronger in the Force. Then that's when Qui-Gon kind of opens up to Obi-Wan about how to start to learn the ability to disembody himself and continue on throughout the Force whenever he dies. And Obi-Wan then thanks Qui-Gon for his wisdom and promises to meet him again. And Qui-Gon then just kind of spreads outward and disappears back out into the elements. It's a really great short story. I highly recommend reading it. Like I said, the book is called From a Certain Point of View. And like I said, it's a compilation of different short stories focusing on different characters in the Star Wars universe. Highly recommend it. I don't know if I mentioned it again, but I'll mention it again. Dooku Jedi Lost is a fantastic audiobook. I can't recommend it enough. It's great. I'm trying to think. I can't think of... I mean, Queen Shadow, Qui-Gon was mentioned briefly. He was mentioned in it. But yeah, highly recommend it. That's another really fantastic book. But anyway, yes, so recommended reading and watching. There's, like I said, some episodes of the Clone Wars where Qui-Gon reappears and does all that. So, last thing I'm going to touch on. So, one topic of discussion that always kind of comes up when people talk about Qui Gon Jinn, and that is, what if... So, kind of like Marvel's, what if Spider-Man wasn't bitten by the spider? Or, what if Iron Man never made it out of the cave? So, what if Qui-Gon never died and he wasn't killed by Darth Maul? What if Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon were to have defeated Darth Maul? So, I theorize what would happen is Obi-Wan would then become a Jedi Knight. He would face the trials, he would pass. Then Qui-Gon would want to train Anakin. They would probably tell him no, and then at that point, I feel like that Qui-Gon would have left the Jedi Order, he would have exiled himself, and he would have trained Anakin himself. And I think having more of a fatherly figure guiding Anakin, I think that would have been better than him having Obi-Wan. I mean, obviously, if all this would have happened, then the original trilogy wouldn't have happened. So this is alternate timeline here. So alternate timeline, this is what would have happened. And I see Qui-Gon being able to help Anakin not succumb to his anger and fear and doubt and all of that stuff, and help build off of his weaknesses and turn those into strengths. Whereas Obi-Wan just gave like awful advice. Yoda gave awful advice to Anakin. Like whenever Anakin was coming about having like those dreams about Padme and his mom, and Yoda just said, basically, well, just don't think about him. That's really poor advice. So I think having someone like Qui-Gon there who would listen and help guide Anakin properly without the shackles of the Jedi Code, I personally feel like that would have been very interesting to see how it all turned out. I know there was Star Wars Theory who had done a video about like what if Qui-Gon would have lived, and one of the things that I thought was interesting was he theorized that in the Duel of the Fates, Obi-Wan would have been the one who died, and then Qui-Gon, in a rage, would have killed Darth Maul, and in turn, because of losing his apprentice, then the council would have allowed Qui-Gon to have Anakin as an apprentice. And then he would have helped guide him. And the way it all played out was like really, actually really cool. In Revenge of the Sith, whenever Anakin would have confronted Darth Sidious, found out that he was the Sith Lord, and then reported it to the Council, then at that point Qui Gon, well, it would have been Yoda would have been there, Mace Windu would have been there, and Anakin would have been there, and Plo Koon would have been there. Like, all these people would have been there, and like to arrest Sidious, rather than just like, you know, the B team of Jedi. And I love Kit Fisto. He's one of my favorite characters, but they did my boy wrong in that scene. But so having all of them there, having Yoda there, having all these people there to arrest Sidious, and then during the fight, then like behind them, like Anakin shows up, and you know he's there to see the Chancellor get arrested, and then Darth Maul and Obi-Wan show up. They come back to life, and they're there to get revenge on the Jedi as well. Then that's when they start to attack Anakin, and then Qui-Gon shows up, and it's just like this huge duel. And I don't know, the way he described it, I'm like, man, if someone could do a fan film of that, or like a really good edit, I would pay to see that. Like, in a heartbeat, I would pay to see that, because that just sounds badass. So, guys, this has been fantastic. I love talking about Star Wars. Like I said, I'm sorry it took this long to get this episode going and finished, but there was a lot of reading I had to do on this, because I had to catch up on some Star Wars books, and reading them, I had to catch up on comics, I had to listen to the audiobooks. There was a lot, and this is also in honor of the 20th anniversary of Episode 1 being released as well, because, like I said in the last episode, watching Episode 1 again now that I'm older, it's not as bad as I remember it. Like, there's still some cringy parts, but there's still a lot of good to it, and we got a lot of good stuff out of it. Qui-Gon as a character is one of those good things, and I'm totally thankful that we got something like this out of it, because he's an interesting character. He's not a black and white type of character where, there's that gray middle. I guess that's where the gray Jedi comes from. I don't know. But anyway, so this has been awesome for me, because I love talking about Star Wars. I like talking about Qui-Gon because he's an extremely interesting character, as you could tell from this episode. So yeah, seriously guys, I highly recommend those books and the audiobooks and the comics. Go check them out and support this so we can get more good stuff like this, because the more sales they get, the more they're going to make of these. And honestly, the new Star Wars canon post Disney buyout of the books and the comics has been pretty good for the most part. So support it, guys. This has been a history of episode of the Scruffy Looking Nerd Herders podcast, and this is Tyler signing off, and Nerd Herders, assemble.
Alright, you two, let's finish up these drinks and let's get out of here. Oh gosh, I feel like I'm catching some dirty eyes with this Mandalorian armor, so yeah, we should probably head out.